I am a 36-year-old woman from Sweden and have worked in mental health care for 18 years, primarily with people with psychotic illnesses such as schizophrenia. For 9 years, I worked in a group home and had a close relationship with my colleagues there, especially 2 women. In my later years of work, another woman started working with us. Let's call her M for this story. The 4 of us quickly became good friends. She was very shy and reserved, but friendly, and we got along well. However, she was often on long-term sick leave due to her own mental health problems, so we didn't see her often at work. Nevertheless, she always came to our get-togethers after work, and we kept in touch, even when she wasn't able to work full-time. She told us that she herself had a history of schizophrenia, just like the patients we were treating, but that she was medicated and hadn't had any psychotic episodes for years. Since I have training in psychiatry and many years of experience with schizophrenia, I do not judge people with this illness and had no problem being friends with someone who has this diagnosis. And even after what I'm about to tell you, I still feel that way. In the summer of 23, I started a new job in forensic psychiatry, a kind of halfway house for mentally ill offenders. The 4 of us continued to stay in touch and occasionally met for dinner. M told us that she had been evicted from her apartment because she had allegedly accidentally walked into her neighbor's apartment in the middle of the night. She explained that all the doors in the large apartment complex looked the same and she simply took the wrong door by mistake. The neighbor then overreacted and reported her to the police out of pure drama. I thought it was excessive to evict someone for such a reason, but I suspected the landlord might have acted this way because of her medical history. I sympathized with her. I asked her if anything else had happened, but she assured me that was the whole story. In Sweden, it is very difficult to get a new lease if you have been evicted, as you are practically blacklisted. M asked me if she could move in with me, as she was literally on the street and homeless. I, of course, said yes, she could move in with me. I tend to put myself in awkward situations by saying yes first without thinking of myself. I had no idea how serious the situation would become when I agreed. I live in a rather small, 1-bedroom apartment, which barely has space for a bed and a desk, a living room that just holds a sofa and a TV, a small kitchen, and a small bathroom. Plus, I have 2 cats. We decided that M would live in the living room, and I offered to get rid of my sofa so she could put a bed there. But she said the sofa was comfortable enough, and she could sleep on it. I insisted on getting her a bed, but she refused. There is a door between the living room and my bedroom, but only an open archway between the living room and the hallway. To give her a little privacy, I hung a heavy velvet curtain over the archway. There is also a door from my bedroom to the kitchen, so I have to leave a door open at night so the cats can go in and out. Their food bowls and litter box are in the kitchen and bathroom, respectively. Of course, I left the kitchen door open and not the living room door, as M was living there, and we wanted our privacy. She wasn't working at the time, as she was on long-term sick leave again, while I was working shifts. Sometimes I had to get up at 6 a.m., sometimes I didn't get home until around 11 p.m. I suffer from severe insomnia and have to take a combination of Ambien and other medications just to sleep. Even with that, I wake up easily. I therefore asked her to be as quiet as possible on the nights I had to get up early. On days when I was off or working late shifts, it was not a problem if she was louder. She was a heavy smoker and drank a lot of coffee. To make her stay with me more comfortable, I bought her a coffee maker. However, it was located right next to my bedroom door because the kitchen is so small. On our first night together, I had to get up at 6 a.m. I had trouble falling asleep as usual. M had gotten up several times during the night to go for a smoke, and each time I woke up. At 5 a.m., she started making coffee, and the noise of the coffee maker woke me completely. I kindly asked her why she was up so early, if she had something planned. She just replied that she couldn't sleep. I explained to her that I really needed that last hour of sleep, otherwise I would be tired all day and my health would suffer. I also explained that I have epilepsy, which gets worse when I don't get enough sleep. I usually have many seizures when I have less than 4 hours of sleep. I knew the day would be stressful and potentially dangerous for me, as there was a risk of falling and injuring myself. It is also not ideal to have seizures while supervising mentally unstable offenders. I mention this because I quit this job after only 6 months. She said she wanted coffee with her cigarette, but promised to be more mindful in the future. I accepted this and started my day. But it didn't get better. She continued to wake me up early in the morning and at night, but promised every time that she would change. I suggested preparing the coffee the night before, or drinking iced coffee or cola instead, but she refused. At the same time, she demanded that I be quiet from 10 p.m. because she wanted to sleep, which I respected. She also had these phases of binge eating, where she ate my entire fridge and pantry empty. Once, I bought a large loaf of bread, and 30 minutes after I left the apartment, she texted me, "Hey, sorry, I ate your bread. I'll buy a new one when I have money." She had eaten the whole loaf in 30 minutes. I had told her to feel at home and to take whatever she needed, so I couldn't really be angry. But it started to annoy me for 2 reasons. Firstly, it was getting expensive, because she consumed such large quantities. And secondly, it always happened at inconvenient times, such as after a late shift when the shops were closed, and I came home hungry, only to find that she had eaten everything I had bought. M had long black hair that lay everywhere, in the sink, on the floor, in the bathtub. I'm not a clean freak, but I think everyone understands that this is not exactly pleasant. Furthermore, she left her fingernails and toenails on the bathroom floor, and always urine drops on the toilet seat after using the toilet. One day, I discovered silverfish on the bathroom floor. I'd never seen any before, but I knew they feed on hair, skin, and nails, so I suspected the new, unhygienic situation in the bathroom had attracted them. At first, I didn't want to confront her directly because I didn't want to hurt her or make her feel bad. So I put a broom and dustpan in the bathroom to subtly suggest that we should clean more often. However, this didn't seem to help. After a while, I approached her as kindly as possible, with a smile on my face. "Do you think we could try to clean the bathroom floor more often? We both lose hair when brushing, and I saw a silverfish the other day. I don't want it to get worse." I consciously used "we" instead of "you," so she wouldn't feel attacked. She promised to think about it, but nothing changed. I started dating a man I was completely in love with. He also lived in a shared apartment, so it was difficult for us to spend time alone. I asked if it would be possible for us to occasionally have an evening alone in the apartment, and that she could of course also have the apartment to herself, but she didn't like the idea, and claimed she had nowhere to go, no friends or family. I didn't ask her to leave for 24 hours, just for a couple of hours so we could have a little time to ourselves. She could have just gone to the library or taken a walk. I worked 8 to 10 hours daily, 5 days a week, so she had plenty of time alone in the apartment anyway. One of our former colleagues noticed that this situation was straining me because I never had time for myself and felt increasingly suffocated. She offered for M to stay overnight with her. After all, they were also friends. However, M did not want to bother her, even though we explained that she was welcome. I explained that I really only wanted one night for myself and my partner. After some back and forth, she finally agreed and spent one night there. The following week, I spent a night elsewhere so she could also have some time to herself. But when I came home the next morning, my cat's water bowl was completely dried out. There were no spilled water residues on the floor. It looked like someone had wiped the bowl with a cloth. I had filled it to the brim the night before. I asked her how that could have happened, but she said the cats had knocked the bowl over. But as I said, the floor was dry. My cats, who are usually very sociable and quickly cuddle with strangers, increasingly withdrew from her. In the last few weeks, they hardly left my bedroom, except to eat or use the litter box. It seemed as if they were afraid of her, which I couldn't understand, as she was usually so shy and friendly. I had an old cooking pot from the 60s that meant a lot to me. You might wonder why a cooking pot could mean so much to someone, but it belonged to my grandmother, and it's the only thing I own from her.
My mother used to cook with it for me when I was little, and therefore it has great nostalgic value to me. One day, M burned the pot and didn't even attempt to clean it. She just left it on the stove and went out to smoke. When I found it in a ruined state, I had to cry. She didn't even apologize. Furthermore, she broke dishes several times and made no effort to replace them or apologize. All of this increased my frustration towards her. At this point, she had been with me for about 2 months, and she was still waking me up at night, eating my food without leaving anything, never cleaning, never leaving the house, scaring my cats, and ruining my things. I also noticed that she had stolen my prescription sleeping pills, many of them. I have a limited supply and I really need them. One day I had 20 tablets in my bedside table,
and when I came home from work, they were gone. She denied it, which was quite absurd since no one else could have been in the apartment. The summer heat made the situation even more unbearable. I felt trapped in my small bedroom with my 2 cats. I never got time for myself, and only a little time with the man I was dating every 2 weeks. My apartment was messy, and I felt like I was losing control of my own home. One day, I received a message from a former elementary school classmate on Facebook. He asked how I knew M, as he had seen that I had posted that we were roommates. I explained to him that we were former colleagues and she was staying with me because she had been evicted from her apartment. He then said, "I know. Do you know why she was evicted?" I replied, "Yes, she accidentally went into her neighbor's apartment." He countered, "Yes, but that's not the whole story. She broke in and crept up to the neighbor's sleeping baby with a knife in her hand. Luckily, the father woke up, overpowered her, and saved the baby." I felt sick with fear. Could this be true? It would explain why she was evicted, but it sounded so horrible. She seemed so shy and friendly. I had so many questions, but my friend had the full police report. It turned out that the neighbors M had broken into were my school friend's ex-girlfriend and her family. It seemed that M was in a psychosis during the break-in, but that part was not public. However, it became clear to me that she had lied to me about what had happened and about the stability of her condition. My frustration, which was already great, turned into paranoia. I just wanted her to move out. However, we had a contract that stipulated a 30-day notice period. I knew that harshly telling her to leave would mean chaos, so I wanted to approach the situation as kindly as possible. I started looking for cheap hostels for her that I could suggest so she wouldn't end up on the street. I sat down with her and told her that I loved living with her, but longed for time to myself, and that the apartment was simply too small for 2 people. I explained that it was nothing personal, but that I didn't want to live with anyone right now. I said I was sorry and hoped we could remain friends. She looked absolutely devastated and said it was impossible for her to move out. I showed her the hostels I had found and said I understood it wasn't an ideal solution, but that I really needed her to move out because I felt suffocated. Furthermore, the summer heat was getting to me, as I always had to keep the door to my bedroom closed, and that affected my sleep. Finally, she said, "Okay," and promised to arrange a move, but only after the 30-day notice period had expired. I accepted this. On the first night after our talk, she got up at 4:30 a.m. and made coffee. I was close to a nervous breakdown. I was supposed to get up at 6 a.m. but couldn't fall back asleep. In the morning, I asked her for what felt like the 10th time to wait with making coffee until I was up, but she didn't even answer. She just sat on the sofa and stared out the window. I said, "M," again, but she continued to stare. I was frightened, but left the apartment to go to work. She continued to act strangely. continued to make a mess, woke me up at night and ate my food, and all I could think about was the story with the baby and the knife. Finally, I was so annoyed by the noise of the coffee maker that I unplugged it and stored it in my attic, which she had no access to. It might seem childish, but I was completely exhausted.
The next night, I woke up at 4 a.m. because she was making coffee in a saucepan on the stove, not my grandmother's, as that was already ruined, but another one. I tried to talk to her again and explain the situation, but she didn't answer. Instead, I took the saucepan and also brought it to the attic. I know it sounds ridiculous, but I was desperate and just wanted her to stop these nightly coffee rituals. On the third night, I had the man I was dating stay over because I was becoming increasingly paranoid about her strange behavior, her silence, and her staring. I woke up from my light sleep when he nudged me and whispered, "Look at the door." M was standing there silently, staring at us. It was like a scene from a horror movie. Her long black hair fell into her face and she didn't move. I said nothing because I thought she was just standing there briefly to get something, but after a while I realized that she was actually just staring at us. It reminded me of the end of Paranormal Activity, when Katie just stands there and stares at Micah. Finally, I sat up and asked, "What are you doing there?" Before I could finish my sentence, she slammed the door shut. I heard a metallic sound drop on the floor and saw her running into the living room. When I got up to see what had caused the metallic sound, I discovered a kitchen knife on the floor. That was the sound I had heard before she ran off. I took all the knives in my apartment and also brought them to the attic. The next day, I asked a friend to visit me in my apartment so he would be there when I confronted M and told her she had to move out immediately. There were still 27 days left in the notice period, but I couldn't wait any longer. During our conversation, I tried to stay calm. I knew she had a mental illness and probably didn't mean any harm. Despite my frustration, I didn't hate her. I was much more scared and exhausted. But M did not respond to my words. She just stared out the window. Then she left the apartment and sent me a message instead, writing that it was disrespectful of me to bring a friend into her apartment. That night, I thought it would finally be quiet. No coffee maker, no saucepans. But at 3 a.m., I woke up because she was burning dry coffee grounds in a frying pan. At that moment, I was completely terrified. Her face was expressionless and her eyes looked empty and black. I suspected she was in a psychosis. I extinguished the fire and she ran back to the living room without a word. The next day, she had an appointment with her psychiatrist. While she was gone, I packed all her belongings. I sent her a message explaining that she had to pick up her things and give me back the keys. I offered to pay for a hostel for the remaining 26 days. She didn't respond. The man I was dating stayed with me to support me in case there was a confrontation. But M only briefly stopped by to hand me the keys without a word and left. Our former colleagues, who were friends with both of us, later reported that M had moved in with a man she was dating. She stayed with him for a few weeks and then surprisingly found her own apartment. She also started working again, and I was honestly glad to hear that she seemed to be doing better. However, in January 2024, a former colleague told me that M had called her and was talking nonsense. She said everything must burn and spoke of a baby she had to save. Then she set fire to her entire apartment because the voices in her head had commanded her to burn everything to save her friends and family. Her neighbors tried to rescue her from the fire, but she fought against them and even poured alcohol on the flames to intensify the fire. She was arrested and brought to court. Last week, she was convicted of severe arson. She will serve her sentence in a psychiatric facility or a prison, possibly forever. Ironically, she could end up in the facility where I used to work, exactly where she herself once worked. One of our colleagues was a witness in the trial and said that M had stopped taking her medication because she believed it made her feel numb or emotionless, and that she was stable enough to manage without it. However, that was not true. She had also stopped taking her medication during her last weeks in my apartment. When she was staring into space, she was actually slipping into a psychosis. When she stared at me with a knife and burned the pan on the last night, she was already deeply caught in her illness. It is scary to think about what could have happened to me and my cats if she had stayed, or if I were a heavy sleeper. I also often think about what would have happened to the baby she approached with a knife that time. And yes, I know it sounds crazy that I didn't just kick her out back then, but the situation was complicated. I haven't talked about it because my friends still feel compassion for her and downplay my experience. They believe I dramatize things more than they really were. I understand them to some extent. They never saw the darkness in her eyes that I experienced in the last few days. About 5 months ago, a friend of mine was excluded from his degree program because he had bad grades. He was only halfway through his lease and saw no point in staying in the city since he was only here for his studies. He told me that I could take over his lease as a subtenant, and he would only charge me half the rent for it. I thought that was a pretty good deal, of course. Although I come from this city, I thought it was time to leave my parents' house. I had already graduated and had been looking for a new job for some time, but I felt I couldn't miss this opportunity. So I took over his lease and moved into his apartment. The house itself is actually quite nice. It has 3 floors, including the basement, and is located near the university in my city. The area is not necessarily very safe, but I spent many of my student years here and never really felt unsafe. The room in the basement is quite small, but cozy. The other room down here belongs to a girl who is currently a student, and she is quite quiet. In fact, all the girls who live here are good roommates. I wasn't initially thrilled about living with 3 girls, but now I see no reason why I saw that as a problem. They are all great. I am the only one in the house who is not a student, and also the only one originally from this city. The other roommates all come from cities about 1 to 2 hours away. Unless something special is happening, they always go home on the weekends. My friend who was excluded also lives only 2 hours away, so he always went home on the weekends too. I forgot to mention an important piece of information for this story. The house actually has 5 rooms. When all the roommates moved into the house, however, one of the girls had a seizure in her bed and passed away. That was quite shocking for everyone, and the landlord told them not to worry about finding someone new for the room. The rent was never increased, and the room has remained empty ever since. According to the landlord, he found it insensitive to look for someone because he didn't want to turn the death into a financial problem. After the girl's death, her parents came and took her belongings from the room. Since then, it has remained locked, and I never felt the need to go in. The room is on the 2nd floor, and I never go up there anyway, so I never really paid attention to it. The first weekend I spent there was pretty uneventful. I remember staying over at my friend's house one night, and the other night he slept at my place after we had been drinking at one of the college bars near the house. We were pretty drunk and fell asleep immediately when we got home. The next weekend, I was home in my new room and couldn't sleep, so I decided to read a little. I really enjoyed the quietness of the house, as the girls were all away. I come from a Latin American family, and such a calm and peaceful environment was quite rare. I thought I heard some noises from upstairs and assumed one of the roommates had decided to spend the weekend at home, or was perhaps packing her last things before leaving. I didn't think any more about it. I wasn't particularly close friends with the roommates and didn't feel the need to ask them if they were home. It just didn't seem like my business. The girl in the basement was definitely not there that weekend, however. She always locks her door when she's away and leaves it open when she's home. Another weekend, the same month, I woke up at night to go to the toilet and heard toilet flushing upstairs. That was strange, as I knew none of the roommates should be home. I wanted to check, but was too tired and didn't care at that moment. Ironically, horror movies teach us to be paranoid, but for me, the biggest lesson from them was that there is always a rational explanation for everything. That proved to be my biggest mistake, because for months I ignored such incidents and paradoxically invented irrational explanations to rationalize what I considered irrational thoughts.
For example, I heard creaking from the second floor and thought one of the roommates had forgotten something and came back to get it. In my head, I imagined someone driving 2 hours round trip in the middle of the night to pick something up. One Saturday, I woke up to get some water and noticed that the basement roommate's door was open and her car wasn't in the driveway. No cars were in the driveway, but I should mention that one of the roommates doesn't own a car. A few hours later, I woke up again because I heard footsteps going down to the basement. I called out the name of the roommate who doesn't have a car because she was the only one who could have been home. I got no answer and only heard the steps going back upstairs. From this point on, I felt increasingly uncomfortable spending the weekends alone at home and started spending my weekends at my friend's place. One of the roommates had created a Facebook page for the house to address issues like washing up or leaving messes. However, the page was barely active because everyone got along well. I posted there that I had noticed eerie things on the weekends and asked if they could let me know if they were staying home overnight. The responses were not very serious. They consisted of comments like, "Leo Mao," or "OMG, you're so funny." Even my friend thought I was silly because he also believed that everything must have a rational explanation. The problem, however, is that if you say everything has an explanation, you automatically exclude paranormal or ghostly activity. However, that was never my point. I never believed in ghosts or things like that, nor did I ever claim to. When I talked to my roommates or my friend, they always said the house was old and made noises. But I know the difference between old house noises and the sound of someone walking up and down the stairs. Luckily, my roommates finally started posting on the Facebook page whether they were home on the weekend. However, the posts were often joking, like, "Hey, lol, I'm not home this weekend, so don't worry about the ghosts." One weekend, everyone let me know they wouldn't be home, and my friend was on night shift, so I had to spend the night alone. During my friend's work break, he called me, and while I was talking to him, I heard noises downstairs. I told him I would check, and he encouraged me, as he still thought I was overreacting. As I said this, I heard footsteps going back upstairs to the second floor. When I got downstairs, no one was in the kitchen, and all the doors in the house were locked. I was extremely paranoid and didn't feel safe at all. My friend calmed me down on the phone and convinced me that everything was fine. That's why I never went up to the second floor, and it was probably better that I didn't check there. After this weekend, I spoke to my roommates in all seriousness and explained to them that I was convinced someone had been in our house at some point during the night. I told them what I had heard, but they continued to claim that it was just the old house making noises. My friend was now almost permanently on night shift, so I did what I never wanted to do. I started spending my weekends at my parents' house. The girls continued to post on the Facebook page whether they were leaving the house, and I decided I should do the same. So I also started announcing whether I was sleeping in the apartment or not. One Friday night, the Facebook page looked something like this: Roommate 1, not home. Roommate 2, not home. Roommate 3, staying home because of a midterm. Me, staying at my parents' house. The next morning, I received an excited message from one of the roommates. She wrote that the roommate who had stayed home for her exam had been attacked. Apparently, she was in her room studying when she heard a noise right outside her door. When she looked, she encountered a man who was just coming out of the deceased girl's room. I later learned more details about the whole thing from the roommate who was attacked. The man looked unkempt, with greasy hair and dirty face. When they made eye contact, he raised his finger to his mouth and said "shh" while smiling. His fingernail was long, and his beard was patchy and scraggly, as if it only grew in certain spots. Instinctively, she screamed, even though she knew no one else was in the house. The man rushed at her as she tried to close the door. She was not seriously injured, as he only yelled at her and told her to be quiet. He said something like, "I won't bother you, but shut your mouth." He hit her, but not hard enough to knock her unconscious. Then he left her room, went down the stairs, and out the front door. The deceased girl's room remained unlocked after this incident. My roommate locked herself in her room and immediately called the police, who arrived very quickly. What was eerie about the whole thing was that the police inspected the deceased girl's room and kept asking, "How long has this room been empty? No one has rented this room, right? The parents took everything after her death." The man had apparently set up the room well for himself. He had brought a small mattress that he had placed on the bed frame. The mattress was, of course, far too small for the frame. He left most of his belongings behind, presumably because he didn't expect to run into anyone that evening. It seemed as if the man had not known that the roommate would be in the house that evening, as she was usually never there. It was probably a shock for him when I moved in, because before that he had the entire house to himself 2 days a week. The police asked me many questions and were very interested in my statements about the footsteps I had heard at night. My 3 roommates and my friend were now convinced that the deceased girl might not have died of a seizure, but that the man might have murdered her. But I think an autopsy would have been able to distinguish murder from natural death. However, to their credit, the whole situation is extremely creepy. We don't know how long the man lived in the room, but it is very likely that it was several months. It is suspected that he entered through the window, so it is possible that he was also there at times when we were all in the house. The police showed great interest in speaking to the landlord to find out how the man could have known about the empty room. The landlord is actually a pretty decent guy, and I have no indication that he could be involved in any way. Interestingly, after all this, I didn't feel the need to react with an "I told you so." I was simply relieved that my roommate was safe, even though she looked very shaken. I just wish more people had listened to me when I told them I thought someone was coming into the house.
I had even mentioned that it could be a squatter, but everyone had just laughed. The whole thing only happened recently, and it might take a while for there to be an update. The man has not been found yet, but the police remain optimistic about catching him. This month has been really bad for me, and I'm not sure if I want to stay in this house. My lease is expiring soon, and I recently lost my job, so it might be best to leave the house now. I doubt the man will come back, as all his belongings have been removed, but I still feel uneasy in this house. I'm definitely not spending weekends there anymore.
This happened years ago, but it still affects me today. Sorry for the length of the story, but I feel like I have to tell the whole thing. The summer after I graduated from school, I was still living at home. One evening, I was up late, packing for a camping trip with my friends. It was incredibly hot, and I had the window open while I was folding my clothes. It was about 1 a.m. when suddenly a hand came through the gap in my window screen. I screamed, and the hand quickly retreated. I was shocked, but a part of me thought it might be my younger brother teasing me. I got up and looked out the window, but all I saw was the silhouette of a man staring at me. I ran into my brother's room, who was playing video games. We immediately called the police, who came and searched the area. They found nothing and warned us to lock the windows and doors. Then they drove away. We were all shaken, and my mother had a feeling the man would come back. It turns out that a mother's intuition is often right. She went outside and waited on our back porch. After about 20 minutes, she saw a man dressed entirely in black sneaking into our garden along the tree line. Unfortunately, there was no fence on that side. He hid behind a tree for a few seconds, then ran to another tree and slowly moved toward my window. My mother shouted something at him and he ran away. The police came back, but again found no trace of him. I never opened that window again, not even the curtains. My parents installed motion detectors with lights, and that seemed to be the end of these incidents. About 6 months later, a friend and I moved into an apartment downtown. We were incredibly excited as it was our first own home. The apartment wasn't the best quality, but it was exciting to live in the city. The downside was that there was only street parking. After a few weeks, my car was broken into. Nothing was stolen, but a single rose lay on the passenger seat. That was creepy, but I swore to myself to be vigilant and careful. I always tried to park near the entrance under the streetlights, but often that was difficult and I had to park further away on darker streets. The situation quickly escalated. My car was broken into at least once a week, usually with a flower left behind, which I always threw on the ground. Once, however, I found men's underwear, and another time a bag of Tootsie Rolls was there, my favorite candy. That made me realize that the person probably knew me personally. I began to view everyone around me with suspicion. There was a laundry room in the basement of our apartment building. One day, I went down there to get my laundry out of the dryer. As I started folding the clothes, I noticed that all my underwear, bras, and panties were gone. A week later, I had a friend visiting, and during his stay, his tires were slashed. By this time, I had already started making plans to move. The situation was becoming increasingly creepy, especially when I received the first letter. In the letter, the sender described his love for me, which had allegedly existed for years. He mentioned things that proved that he had been watching me closely. I managed to find a friend who was willing to take over my lease, and I moved to the other side of the city with another friend. The new building was secure and had an underground garage accessible only to tenants. I felt much safer, and the extra money was definitely worth the peace of mind. For a few months, it remained quiet, until my roommate, Ashley, got a new boyfriend. Most of us were skeptical of Ashley's new boyfriend from the start. They had met on MySpace after he contacted her. Another reason for our suspicion was that Matt, her new boyfriend, was extremely good-looking, while Ashley, though a wonderful person, wasn't the type one would typically imagine with someone like him. Ashley was thrilled, as she had never had a boyfriend, and she considered him her Prince Charming. I found Matt strange and creepy from the start. He was a quiet guy with an unpleasant, lopsided smile. It was difficult to have a normal conversation with him, as he always threw in strange, irrelevant facts that had nothing to do with the topic. I had deleted my MySpace account when the stalking began, but I created a fake profile to find out more about Matt. His profile seemed strange. He had barely any friends, and there was no evidence that he knew the few contacts he had in real life. There were only photos of himself, and the rest of the information was vague. My friends and I cautiously tried to convince Ashley not to meet Matt anymore. Technically, he hadn't done anything wrong, but he was just strange. Ashley immediately became defensive and ended any conversation about it. Matt started spending more time in our apartment, and I looked for every excuse not to be home. One day, I came home from work and found Matt alone on my couch with a beer in his hand. Ashley had been called to work and had told him he could just wait. I was angry because I didn't want to spend time with him, so I grabbed a beer and a snack, went to my room, and closed the door. After about 30 minutes, Matt knocked on my door and suggested we watch TV together to get to know each other better because we both liked Ashley. I didn't want to, but I thought I should at least try. He put on a movie, and I tried to concentrate on it so I wouldn't have to talk to him. During the movie, I briefly looked over at him and noticed that he was staring at me with a smile on his face. Annoyed, I asked him, "What?" Still smiling, he replied, "I just can't believe it." "What can't you believe?" I asked. But he said nothing more and turned back to the movie, still smiling. This interaction sent a chill down my spine, and I felt like every hair on my body was standing up. I excused myself and locked myself in my room. Another month passed, and I barely managed to be home except to sleep and shower. Matt was practically living with us and even brought many of his belongings into Ashley's room. I really didn't want to move again, but I started looking for alternatives. On the day of their 6-month anniversary, I discovered a huge bouquet of flowers on the table and an already opened card next to it. Annoyed, I was about to leave, but decided to take a look to see what this strange guy had written to Ashley. When I opened the card, my heart started pounding. Without reading the words, I immediately recognized the handwriting. It was identical to the one in my stalker's letters. I had kept the letters as evidence and got them out of my desk to compare. There was no doubt Matt was my stalker. I immediately called the police. While they were on their way, I contacted Ashley and asked her to come home. She was at work, but said she would come as soon as possible. I was afraid to tell her the truth because I knew how much it would hurt her. The police took my statement and even went to Ashley's workplace to talk to her and explain the situation. Despite the police warning, Ashley left Matt an angry message. She shouldn't have said anything, but he disappeared without a trace afterwards. When the police investigated, it turned out that Matt had never been seen at the place where he allegedly worked. Ashley had never visited his apartment because he claimed to be staying with friends to save money for a trip to Europe. His family allegedly lived in another state, and she had never met any of his friends because he said they had fallen out because he spent so much time with Ashley. It was all a lie. In the end, she had been dating a complete stranger. We didn't even know if Matt was his real name. The police searched Matt's belongings that he had left behind when he disappeared. Ashley and I went through his things and found a sports bag. Inside were gym clothes, and in one of the compartments, about 10 photos of me. Most were taken from a distance, but one showed me sleeping. The sheets in the photo were current, which meant that he must have been in my apartment before I started locking my bedroom door. Some of the photos were even from before the incident at my parents' house, leading us to suspect that he had been the perpetrator back then as well. In the bag, there were also 2 of my missing underwear. I shuddered at the thought of what he might have done with the others. A Starbucks cup with my red lipstick on it, a necklace that I hadn't even noticed was missing, and a few other disturbing souvenirs. The police were never able to locate him, and I decided to accept a job offer abroad that I had previously considered. I just wanted to get away. Ashley and I quickly became estranged. She had a lot of trouble accepting that her first boyfriend was a complete psychopath. I probably also had some underlying anger, perhaps misguided, because she believed him and let him into our lives. I don't know what Matt's ultimate goal was. Would he have tried to hurt me, or was he simply content with just being a part of my life? I'll probably never know. Being stalked changes you. When I lived on the other side of the world, I constantly looked over my shoulder. To this day, I don't have any social media linked to my real name. Now I'm married and have children, but every time I visit my hometown, I'm tense and keep a low profile. A part of me will always fear that Matt might reappear one day.
I've had problems with my dorm roommate since the start of the semester. She didn't shower or wash her clothes regularly, left dry ramen noodles on the floor that I had to step on, never washed her hands or flushed the toilet, and constantly sighed in a way that sounded like sexual noises. She showered with the door open, getting water everywhere, and there were so many other things that bothered me. Basically, every single one of my biggest annoyances was embodied in this girl. At first, I chalked it up to her not understanding American etiquette, as she is an international student from China, but then it got creepy. A few weeks into the semester, I went home for the weekend and told her beforehand that I wouldn't be there. She made those strange, sexy sighs again, looking sad and betrayed at the same time, as if I was doing something wrong by leaving her. She said something like, "Why are you leaving me alone? I don't like sleeping alone in the room. I feel more comfortable when you're here." Mind you, I had only met this girl on move-in day and had exchanged very few words with her. I should have been more cautious then. After that, she sometimes stared into space for minutes, sometimes up to half an hour. Occasionally, I caught her watching me study out of the corner of my eye. One evening, after a long day at the library, I went to the terrace of our dorm to get some ice cream and found her with her head on the table, eyes wide open, staring at something in the distance. I think she scared away the guy I liked because he stopped coming by after he found out she was my roommate.
After she had scared me so often, I started avoiding my room and only went there to sleep or get things. She seemed like a nice person, but I just couldn't live with her anymore. Today, I wrote an email to the dorm manager that I wanted to switch rooms. I told her that I no longer felt comfortable living with my roommate. I was sitting in my room today while my roommate was away when I suddenly heard a knock at the door. Two serious-looking campus police officers and the dorm manager of my building stood there. They calmly asked me where my roommate was, but I had no idea. I told them her usual haunts and went back to what I was doing. Something didn't feel right, however. I asked them what was going on, but they ignored my question and only wanted to know where she might be. The campus police officers usually seem friendly, as there is hardly any crime on our campus and they don't have much to do. About half an hour later, there was another knock at my door. My roommate stood there, tears streaming down her face. She rushed past me to her bed and collapsed onto it. She started whimpering, screaming, and finally hyperventilating. I thought maybe someone she knew had died and regretted asking for a room change at this difficult time. I could only understand a few fragments of what she was saying to the dorm manager. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. I promise I won't do it again." The police officer pulled me aside and quietly asked if there was anything in the room with which she could hurt herself. I pointed to her wooden drawer where I had occasionally seen a small knife with a wooden sheath. She searched the drawer but found nothing. Suddenly, my roommate was standing right behind her and screamed, "Don't you dare go through my things! We don't want you to hurt yourself. Please calm down. You think I want to hurt my roommate? I wouldn't do that. She's just being silly. I won't hurt anyone. I just want to be left alone." Then the dorm manager pulled me out of the room and explained what had happened. She had had a big fight with her best friend. I didn't even know she had a friend, and had started sending threatening emails and even threatened to take her own life. I was completely shocked. I had just seen someone completely break down. The dorm manager told me that she had received my request for a room change and wanted to talk to me tomorrow. I told her I would be staying with a friend overnight. After my roommate calmed down a bit, I went into the room while the dorm manager and the police officer were talking to her to quickly pack a bag for the night. She apologized for her crazy behavior, and I half-heartedly accepted the apology, grabbed my things, and disappeared as quickly as possible. I was waiting in the common room of the dorm for my friend when I remembered I had forgotten a blanket. I went back to the room, assuming someone would be there to watch her, but she was alone. She stared at me hatefully as I walked past her to get my blanket. There was pure hatred in her eyes. "Where are you going?" she asked in a voice I had never heard from her before. She was furious. "I'm staying with a friend," I said in the most cheerful tone I could muster. "Slumber party. We have a midterm on Friday." Not entirely true, but I was glad I could react quickly. I practically ran to my friend's dorm. I spoke with the dorm manager again, but unfortunately there were no more vacant rooms in my dorm complex. If I wanted to move to another complex, my parents would have to pay an extra $1,000. They were angry and wanted me to move immediately because the police officer had jeopardized my safety by asking me that question right in front of my roommate. They didn't want to pay because they felt it was the university's fault for putting me in this awkward situation. I was afraid she might take her anger out on me. I didn't think I could go back to my room. When I returned earlier to get my blanket, she looked like she was out for revenge. To clarify, I am female and was 20 years old when this happened. I moved out of the room completely yesterday to my new dorm. My new roommates are really great so far. My old roommate is now going to counseling, which I truly hope helps her overcome her problems. As for the extra cost for the new room, I haven't heard anything from my parents yet. I think they don't want me to worry about it. My father spent an hour on the phone with campus security, the dorm manager, and the housing administration because of this incident. From past situations, I know he is not afraid to take legal action. I went back to my old room when she wasn't there to pack my things into boxes. I received an email from the dorm manager assigning me a new room, but I had to give my new roommates 24 hours before moving in. My roommate came into the room when I was almost finished packing and gave me an angry look. Then she simply sat down against the wall and started interrogating me. My room was shaped like a laterally turned Z block, so I was clearing out my closet while she was sitting out of my sight. I heard her muttering and thought she was talking to her family on Skype as her laptop was in her lap. Then she started speaking louder and in an angry tone. Note that this conversation happened very quickly and took place within minutes while I was considering what I needed for another night outside the stuffy room. Did the housing administration tell you to move out? I think we both just need some distance. Why are you being so cold to me now? You weren't like that before. Don't you like me anymore? Is it because of last night? In my head, I thought, of course it's because of last night. But I just said, I don't handle stressful situations well, and my studies aren't exactly helping either. Can you please tell me what I did wrong so I don't make the same mistakes with the next roommate? Did I scare you last night? Of course, I didn't want to tell her everything that bothered me because she was already angry, and I didn't want to provoke her more. I don't think it matters anymore, I said. It is because of last night, isn't it? I need an answer now because I feel like everyone is leaving me and I need to know why. At first I felt a little sorry for her, but the way she said it made that thought instantly vanish. I had a difficult time last semester too. I understand you need space to sort out your thoughts. The campus is so small that we barely have time for ourselves. What kind of family issues? She asked in a mocking tone. The kind that I don't want to talk about with you or anyone else. If you'll excuse me now. I grabbed as many things as I could carry and left the room as quickly as possible. One of my new roommates later told me that she had seen my old roommate crying uncontrollably in the cafeteria at dinner. The next day, I returned with a few friends to get the rest of the heavy boxes. I explained the situation to them and asked them not to leave me alone in the room, just in case. When we were almost finished, my old roommate came into the room, but she was in a better mood this time. I truly hoped that the counseling center was able to help her overcome her problems.
About 2 years ago, I moved into a new apartment. The walls were very thin, and due to fire safety laws in my city, my bedroom had a window facing the living room, but no window to the outside. This window will become important later. It was a 3-bedroom apartment, 1 room for me, 1 for the main tenant, and another that was rented by a fairly nice guy at the time. However, this nice guy had problems with his work visa and had to return to Canada on short notice, leaving us about 2 weeks to find a new roommate. Our quickest and easiest option was Craigslist. Due to my work schedule, I had no involvement in the selection process, but was satisfied when the new roommate moved in. At first, he seemed a bit strange. He was very tall and stocky, but quite quiet. Not the type I wanted to spend a lot of time with, but it was fine to get along with him. About 2 weeks after he moved in, the main tenant traveled to Hawaii, leaving me and the new roommate, whom we will call Keel, alone in the apartment for the duration of his 1-month stay. The first few days went normally, but about 4 days later, I was woken up around 8 a.m. by a frantic knocking on my door. When I opened it, Keel was standing there, looking confused. He looked directly into my eyes and said, "So, are you going to tell me what happened last night?" I was shocked and confused, as I had come home from work around 9 p.m. the night before, showered, and immediately gone to bed. I explained this to him, and he told me that he had heard me arguing with someone in my room. He claimed he had even seen me outside in the side hallway discussing with our landlord, whom I had never met at that time, and that he had heard people coming and going. I told him none of that happened. After a long, skeptical look, he finally left and didn't bring it up again. The next morning, the same thing happened again. This time he said he had seen me arguing with my boyfriend, but I was single at the time. He also claimed I had spoken to our other roommate who was in Hawaii and wanted to know the badge number of a police officer I had allegedly talked to. This time, I got angry and more or less told him to stop it because I had no idea what he was talking about. He got a strange look on his face and said, "I think I had a seizure in my sleep. If it happens again, call an ambulance." Then he left, only to knock on my door again about an hour later and repeat the exact same story word for word. This happened once more before I told him to leave me alone and went to work. However,
I was hesitant to return that night, but was too tired to find another place. A big mistake, because around 1 a.m. I woke up to doors slamming. Keel was pacing between his bedroom, the living room, and the front door, going into every room, turning the lights on and off, muttering angrily and slamming doors. Through the frosted glass window in my bedroom that led to the living room, I could see his silhouette. Since my room was dark, he couldn't see me. Suddenly he screamed, "I can't live like this. Why are you doing this to me?" I thought he was on the phone, so I didn't answer. Shortly after, he screamed my name, repeated my name, and I realized he meant me. I knew I had to get out immediately, so I quietly got dressed and packed a bag for work the next morning. Almost finished, I suddenly heard him shout, "I hear you." He stormed to my room and slammed his fist against the wall next to my door, but didn't touch it. I looked through the window and saw a shadow lean forward, pressing his ear against the glass. I sat there, frozen, not moving. Finally, he screamed my name again, but walked away and started pacing between the rooms again. I decided to wait until he left the apartment through the front door again to put on my shoes and flee. Suddenly, I heard him say, "Do you want to discuss this now? Come out. We'll settle this now." I'm small, about 5'2", and Keel was at least 3 times my size. Fighting was not an option. After a few minutes, he turned off all the lights, opened and closed his bedroom door, and then it was quiet. I waited a moment, and then decided to take my chance. I opened the door quickly, grabbed my shoes, and then saw him standing in the hallway, shirtless, only in boxers and socks. He said in a calm voice, "Ma'am, we need to talk." That was my cue. I ran out of the apartment with my shoes in my hand and ran barefoot for about half a block before stopping to put them on. When I looked back, Keel was standing under the porch light, watching me, but not moving. Fortunately, I had a friend who lived about 2 blocks away and whose spare key I had. I let myself in there and stayed the night. I stayed there for the next few days while we sorted everything out with the main tenant. Keel agreed to move out within a week. On the day Keel moved out, he sent me a photo of the house key on the table and wrote, "I'm out." Nothing else. I went back with a friend to make sure he was really gone. There, we discovered that he had not only left behind a lot of food and furniture, but had also ripped all the smoke detectors out of the ceilings. He had also unscrewed the bolt lock on the front door and neatly placed it on the hallway table. Then it dawned on us that my front door could only be locked from the outside with a key, and the door was locked when we arrived. That meant Keel still had a key. We immediately called a locksmith. Even after the locks were replaced, I was afraid to stay there alone. Every night I barricaded the doors with chairs and other furniture before going to sleep. To this day, I am still afraid for my safety. Keel was obviously mentally unstable, but I wonder what could have happened if I hadn't been so lucky.
Many, many years ago, before I had children, rescue animals, a mortgage, and a husband, I was a travel writer in Europe. Most of my trips I undertook alone. This story is about my first visit to Prague. I had never been to Prague, and the trip was very spontaneous, so I had little time to prepare. A travel partner had stood me up in another country, and I was determined to make the best of the situation by visiting a place I had never been before. Upon arrival at the train station, I visited the accommodation office and asked for a hostel near the center. Being in my early 20s, traveling into the blue was part of the adventure for me, but today I am far less adventurous. The hostel they sent me to was a sprawling, dilapidated Art Deco building in slate gray on an unassuming street about 10 minutes from the city center.
The interior was probably beautiful once, but at the time I checked in, it was full of shabby, mismatched furniture and cheap stained carpets. Most of the lamps were broken, making everything except the lobby dark and gloomy. It smelled of stagnant water and dust. I found my room, a double room, for $12 a night, and noticed that I had a roommate. She wasn't there, but on her side of the room there was a suitcase, a dress neatly draped over the back of a plastic chair, some makeup containers on the worn desk, and a stack of German fashion magazines on the bed. Since I had no plans or goals for this spontaneous trip, I spent the afternoon exploring the Old Town Square, the Jewish Quarter, and Wenceslas Square. I bought some Bohemian crystal glass for my mother and painted eggs from a street vendor for myself. I also reserved a sunset dinner cruise for one person. Around 6 p.m., I returned to my room to shower, change, and drop off my purchases. When I left the room about an hour later, there was no indication that my roommate had returned at any point during the day. After the boat trip, I stopped at a small bar on Tynska Street and had a glass of wine. I had heard many horror stories about the dangers in Prague, but I didn't feel any more uncomfortable than in other big cities. Sure, the cobblestone streets, the fog rising from the Vltava River, the illuminated Gothic architecture and the winding alleys reminded me of Jack the Ripper and Dracula, but in a positive way. It was almost midnight when I returned to my hostel, and I was surprised that my roommate still hadn't returned. However, that wasn't necessarily unusual. Backpackers are an unpredictable lot. Maybe she had gone on a short trip, left her things behind, or was staying with someone she had met. I was surprised, but not worried. I took another shower before bed, but I was surprised that something in the room had changed. Her bed was neatly made, the magazines were on the bedside table, and the dress was gone. The strangest thing, however, was a pink silk nightgown that lay on her bed and on my bed. Maybe she thought she still had the room to herself. I carefully pushed the nightgown onto her bed and got ready for bed. While writing in my diary, I thought she was showering or somewhere nearby and would be back soon. After about an hour, however, her side was still empty. I had to use the toilet one more time before going to sleep, so I made a final trip down the hallway. The building was unusually quiet. There were none of the usual sounds of chatty backpackers, clinking glasses, or music drifting through the walls. It was silent like a church after the congregation had left. I found myself almost creeping back to my room, which was at the end of the hallway. I couldn't shake the feeling that the corridor was darker than before. The few functioning lights flickered as if trying to stay on, and it reminded me of a haunted house. My stomach clenched, and I unconsciously quickened my steps. Relieved, I rushed into my room, but the feeling didn't last long. Everything was exactly as before, except that the pink nightgown was back on my bed. Sleep came only in short bursts. I left the lamp on, convinced that my roommate would be back soon, but the shadows it cast made the room even spookier. It was too dark with the light off. At some point, I fell into a deep sleep, but suddenly I heard the door open. A man stood in the doorway, only dimly lit by the light in the hallway. "I didn't want this. You have to help me." Too confused and disoriented to be afraid, I sat up, rubbed my eyes, and reached for the light switch. But when the room was illuminated, the door was closed, and no one was there. I jumped out of bed and rushed to the door. It was locked. No one could have entered without a key. The hallway was empty. I spent the rest of the night sitting, fully dressed, with the light on. Although I had paid for 2 more nights, I went to the reception at 7 a.m. to check out. "By the way," I said to the roughly 20-year-old receptionist, "my roommate never came back. I'm a little worried." She took the room key, looked at it closely, frowned, and glanced at her computer. What room were you in again?" When I told her, she looked at the screen again. "Ma'am, that room has been empty for 3 weeks and cleaned afterward. We have 6 people in the entire building. The hostel has since been renovated and is now a luxury hotel."
My name is Jules, and this story happened in 2002. At that time, I was a business school student, but my English skills left much to be desired. To improve, I decided to take a year off and move to Toronto, Canada, to attend an intensive language course. Since the costs were high, I found a shared apartment with other students, which had 3 bedrooms, one of which was still empty and awaiting a new roommate. My roommate, Sandro, was a Swiss-German man, tall, almost 6 feet 6 and 265 pounds, but also very friendly. We quickly became friends. A few weeks later, Sandro told me he was planning a 1-week trip through Canada's national parks. He was scheduled to leave on a Saturday morning, while I had learned that the new roommate would arrive on the same day around 3 p.m. Sandro left the apartment at 10 a.m., leaving me alone to wait for the newcomer. The hours passed, 3 p.m., 4 p.m., 8 p.m., and finally 10 p.m., but no one came. I had a snack, watched a series on Netflix, and finally decided to just go to bed. Around midnight, I was suddenly awoken by a knock at the apartment door. I heard someone come in. Oh, that must be the new roommate, I thought, before hearing an unfamiliar voice explaining the layout of the apartment. I stayed in my room, too tired to go out, and just fell back asleep. But a few minutes later, there was a knock at my door. First once, then 10 minutes later a second time. Thinking there might be a problem, I finally got up. In front of me stood a young Japanese woman, about 25 years old. I quickly explained a few details about the apartment to her, we exchanged Instagram handles, and then we both went to our rooms for the night. In the following days, she often asked me to accompany her when she took the bus or subway. I was happy to help her, showing her the stops and the best places to find her way around, before returning to my own routine of classes and the gym. But gradually, something strange began to happen. Every evening, when I came back, she would either talk to me via messages or approach me when we ran into each other in the apartment. The situation became increasingly stressful. One evening, as I lay on my bed, I noticed a figure on the shared balcony right outside my bedroom window. She was leaning on the railing, staring at me. Her gaze was intense and unsettling. When she realized I had seen her, she quickly turned around and went back to her room. I shuddered at the thought, but tried to convince myself it was just a coincidence. Later, around midnight, after I had turned off the light to fall asleep, I glanced out the window, and there she was again. She was standing there, watching me. Our eyes met again, and then she immediately disappeared. The scene repeated itself in the following nights. Every evening, I caught her watching me from the balcony, always at the same time and always with that fixed gaze. And each time, she disappeared as soon as she realized I had seen her. But on the night before my departure, the situation took an even more alarming turn. One morning, I had to get up particularly early for an appointment. It was 5:30 a.m. when I left my room. The entire apartment was shrouded in darkness, except for the faint light that shone under the bathroom door, where I went to brush my teeth. Suddenly, I heard a sound behind me. The young woman came out of her room silently, her footsteps echoing softly on the wooden floor. She knew I was there. She saw the light under the door. I froze. A shiver ran down my spine. I stood there, in my underwear, toothbrush in hand, wondering what she wanted. But instead of turning back, she opened the bathroom door and sat down on the closed toilet opposite me. She didn't say a word, just sat there motionless, her gaze fixed on me,
with a blank, almost expressionless face. The scene dragged on for long, icy seconds, during which the silence became increasingly oppressive. Then I slowly collected myself and left the room, closing the door behind me. I returned to my room very slowly, trying to show that I was not panicking about what was happening. In the days that followed, I became increasingly cautious, watching her every move, but she continued her behavior, watching me every evening from the balcony, like a disturbing shadow in the night. Until, on the night before my departure, the events became even more frightening. I was eating dinner in my room when I saw her through the window again. She was staring intensely inside. I looked away, hoping she would leave. Later, around 3 a.m., I suddenly woke up from a nightmare. I turned my head, and there she was, still on the balcony, her eyes wide open, fixed on me. My blood ran cold. This time she didn't look away. She remained motionless, like a statue. Then she abruptly turned around and ran into the apartment. My heart raced. I hurried to lock my door and buried myself under the blanket, hoping it was just a bad dream. A few seconds later, I heard footsteps behind my door. Then an attempt to open it, first gently, then more forcefully. She was pushing the handle, trying to get into my room. In panic, I remained still and held my breath. Then, everything went quiet again. I heard nothing more. She must have gone back to her room, but the night felt endless. The next day, I returned to France. She was no longer in the apartment. I think she was just fascinated to see a European. After all, I don't have a typical appearance, especially not for a Japanese woman. I can bench press over 330 pounds. Maybe she was looking for an adventure with me, or wanted to steal my passport. Take care, everyone.
When I transferred from the local community college to a university a few hours away in my third year of study, I didn't know anyone who lived there. The university didn't have dorms, but it recommended apartments near the campus. It was obvious they received some kind of commission if students indicated they had found out about the apartments from the university. I was pretty broke at the time and wanted to meet new people immediately, so I chose an apartment that offered a roommate matching service. You filled out a questionnaire about demographics, hobbies, and interests, and the service found a compatible roommate. Although I had seen bad reviews about the apartment online, I decided to try it because it was under new management and the lease was only for a year. It couldn't be that bad, could it? I was assigned to another man in a 2-bedroom, 2-bathroom apartment. I was excited to move in and get to know him. I moved in a few days after the lease began, probably about 3 weeks before the start of the semester, and immediately began to regret my decision. The apartment was terrible and smelled of mold and old cigarettes. To my dismay, a used ashtray was on the coffee table when I arrived. When they said the apartment was furnished, I hadn't expected it to look exactly like an old home. My roommate showed up about a week later. When he finally came, I found out he was about 35 years old and wasn't even studying at my university. He was unkempt and smelled of old cigarettes and sweat. Over time, I found out that he had previously been homeless and had taken out a student loan to pay the application fee and the first few months' rent. However, he had never enrolled in any courses. After a few months, he stopped paying rent, and it took about 6 months for him to be evicted by the apartment management. In the state I lived in, the eviction had to be done in court, and the courts were overloaded, so the process dragged on. While he was still living in my apartment, he never changed his clothes. He always wore the same worn-out camouflage pants and a dirty, stained undershirt. I even offered him clothes that I had sorted out and that would have fit him, but he was content with what he had. He also often invited friends from his time in homeless shelters to stay with us. It wasn't uncommon to come home and see a stranger using my washing machine, even when my roommate wasn't home.
If I brought someone into my room to spend time with, he would peer through a crack in the door and watch us with the creepiest expression. And he did this every single time. Over time, and with his increasingly strange behaviors, I felt more and more uncomfortable. One night, in the middle of the night, I was sleeping with a man I was dating at the time when I heard a knock on my bedroom door. It was about 3 a.m. I asked my friend to see who it was, and when he opened the door, an older, dirty man stood there, completely naked. He said he was a friend of my roommate and thought he was in the room with me. Of course, I panicked. My roommate must have let the man in, as the door was locked and the apartment was small. It was impossible that he didn't know where his friend was. I threw the naked man out and went straight to my roommate's room. He was sitting in the corner in the dark, almost as if waiting for me. I asked him what was going on, but he pretended not to know anything. I reluctantly dropped the matter, as eviction notices were piling up on his door. It was only a matter of time until he was gone. After he finally moved out, I thought my problems were over. But a few weeks later, there was a knock at my door, and when I opened it, the naked man was there again, this time with a garbage bag full of dirty laundry. He said my former roommate had allowed him to use my washing machine. I prevented him from coming in and explained that his friend no longer lived there. Then I locked the door and went back to my room. A few minutes later, I heard a strange noise from my balcony. I lived on the 3rd floor and thought it was an animal. When I checked, I saw the man trying to climb onto my balcony. I threatened to call the police, and he disappeared before I could do anything. The same day, I went to the apartment management and demanded to be released from my lease. After a heated discussion, they finally agreed to let me go. Eventually, I found a nice one-bedroom apartment and have never looked back.
I'm so glad I got out of a potentially dangerous situation where I ended up with a roommate who could have killed me without batting an eye. Even before I moved in, she had a strange attitude. She randomly asked me to swap rooms, but never showed up. Eventually, I got tired of waiting and moved into my room, a 2-bed, 2-bath. When she finally showed up, she tried to push me out of my room by arguing she had a disability and my room was bigger, and she complained about every single thing in the apartment. Here are a few more details. She is 39 years old, divorced, unemployed, not a student, and lives in student housing. She also demanded that I not wear shoes or bring pork into the apartment because she's Muslim. When I agreed, she looked astonished. She probably thought this would be a problem for me and lead to a conflict that would make me move out. What happened in the following days was the most unusual behavior I have ever experienced. She threatened to call the police if I had guests and bragged about how often she had done this in her previous apartment. She also gave long, discriminatory speeches about international students, refugees, people with protected status, and made openly racist remarks. She claimed she was a victim of injustice in her previous apartment and that the staff had stolen all her belongings. She started stalking the accused employees online, taking screenshots of their families' houses and even their cars. She also stalked a student who had a restraining order against her and frequently asked me if I knew him and how she could find him. She washed shoes and pillows at 1 a.m., and when I had guests, she messaged me incessantly, threatening to kick them out until we actually left. I documented her behavior from the start and was constantly communicating with the administration about it. One night, I moved a dishcloth she had hanging on the oven handle aside while the oven was on because I thought it was a fire hazard. She then knocked loudly on my door at 11 p.m. and complained that I had touched her things. She also said she would clean up my dirt. I asked her what dirt because I hadn't made any. The pizza had gone straight from the pan to the oven. She just yelled, "Your dirt," and I simply went back to my room. Another time, she said we should use separate trash cans, since we had two. I agreed. As soon as I set up mine, she started using it. Every night at exactly 10 p.m., she disappeared for an hour and then came back wide awake and talkative. Then, she often gave speeches for hours. One night, she knocked a chat and I pretended to be asleep to avoid it. One day, she asked me if I knew who Jim Jones was. I had no idea and said no. She replied that he had the right idea. A few days later, I Googled Jim Jones and was horrified. For those who don't know him, he was a cult leader and mass murderer, a terrible person. I checked all the new groceries I had bought and found that she had opened all the spices and drinks. I threw everything away. A few days ago, I went to the laundry room to do laundry. She had 2 pairs of pants lying on the machine, so I folded them and put them on the dryer. She came in at the same time and made a big scene. "Don't touch my things, girl," she screamed at me, "for touching my things." No matter how much I explained that I just wanted to use the machine, she claimed she wanted to use it too, but had to buy detergent. I asked her if I could do a load of laundry in the meantime, and she screamed even louder. Then she threatened to call 911 and actually did. When the police arrived, she claimed I had hit her. During questioning, however, she confessed that I hadn't hit her, but that she just didn't like my tone of voice. She insulted the police and told them to just do their job and get rid of people like me. One of the police officers actually told her to shut up, but she just kept going. The list goes on. She revealed so much about herself in these nightly tirades. She had been evicted from apartments 3 times, even from her own house, which was foreclosed after the divorce. She was kicked out of 2 other student dorms. The housing administration sued her for her last eviction, but she filed for bankruptcy. I don't know exactly how that works. She appealed, but the judge denied it. The police searched her apartment and confiscated all the weapons she had because she had previously threatened staff. I am so glad I was lucky enough to be able to move into a nice brand new apartment, as everything was full because the semester had just started. She is a dangerous person, and I don't understand why the administration hasn't kicked her out, even though there is so much evidence of her unusual behavior, threats, police reports, and eviction. That makes absolutely no sense to me. She is crazy.
This story didn't happen to me, but to my very good friend whom we'll call Dan. Dan is a 5'10" man from Maryland. He has a distinct sense of humor, is very intelligent, and overall a good guy. We attend the same university. I will tell the story as best as I can, so please be patient. Dan moved into his dorm room in our first year of study before his roommate was there. Dan had already set everything up and had just sat down when his roommate showed up to move in his things. His roommate, whom we will call Brian, introduced himself and brought his mother and father, who helped him move in, totally normal. Dan decided to help Brian move in as he didn't know anyone in the city yet, and Brian was from another state. Together with Brian's family, Dan went to the car while Brian stayed in the room to unpack some things. Here is the first red flag in this story. When they opened the trunk, Brian's father looked Dan directly in the face and said, "Good luck, Dan." Dan thought he meant college and simply replied with "thanks" before carrying up a box, but he couldn't have been more wrong. Dan brought the box into the room when Brian suddenly freaked out. He shouted that the box contained special ingredients for a project and that Dan had probably damaged them. Strange, but everyone has their quirks. Finally, Dan helped with the rest of the move, and Brian's parents said goodbye. This time, too, Brian's father said, "Good luck." That was really strange. Later, a few people came over and asked if Dan and Brian wanted to go out for dinner. Dan agreed, but Brian stayed behind to continue unpacking. While Dan was eating, Brian called and asked if he could smoke marijuana in the room. Dan, who later wanted to work for the CDC, emphatically said no. Brian shouted something incomprehensible and hung up. Shortly after, Brian called again and asked if he could smoke marijuana in the closet. Again, Dan said no, and Brian hung up without a word. Worried, Dan and his friends went back to the room to make sure Brian wasn't smoking. When they arrived, they found him in the closet, not smoking, but eating the marijuana. Strange, right? But that was far from the worst. At night, Brian regularly woke Dan up by standing next to his bed and asking him a question. Dan answered, and Brian silently went back to his bed and fell asleep. This happened every night for a week. During that week, Brian brought a complete toolbox into the room, full of wrenches, screwdrivers, hammers, nails, screws, and power tools, things you really don't need in a dorm room. Throughout this whole week, Brian hardly ever left the room, only to eat or use the toilet. About 4 days before the deadline for changing rooms, Brian woke Dan up in the middle of the night and asked him what he thought of gay people. Dan replied that he didn't care what others do. The next morning, Dan woke up and saw Brian sitting on a chair right next to his head, staring at him. Instinctively, Dan screamed, "What the hell are you doing?" Brian replied, "I'm starting to develop feelings for you. You should move out. I don't want anything to happen to you with what's coming." After this statement, Dan left the room and slept elsewhere for a few nights until he could switch rooms. Unfortunately, there were no vacancies, so Dan couldn't move immediately. During this time, Brian began to stalk Dan. Brian slept in the closet with his tools and was working on something. Finally, Dan convinced the dorm manager to let him move into the empty room next door. After 3 weeks, Dan moved. 2 days later, there was a knock on Dan's door at 9 a.m. He thought it was friends trying to annoy him and shouted, "What do you want?" When he opened the door, 4 state police officers in full protective gear were standing there. The police officer in front said with a humorous tone, "Good luck." The police allowed Dan to get dressed and escorted him out of the building. At the end of the hallway, Dan saw Brian in handcuffs. It turned out that Brian had been building pipe bombs and other explosive devices in the room during Dan's absence. After Dan moved out, Brian had taken over the other bed and the closet for his bomb-making activities. The reason for the hazmat team was that Brian had spilled liquid mercury, which could have spread to other rooms. In his belongings, the officers also found a plan in which weapons were hidden in the city. Brian had actually planned a major attack. In his documents, Dan's name was found with a heart around it and the note, "Do not kill." This crazy roommate. I hope I never meet someone like that.